Am I audible?
Both audible and visible.
Beautiful. Starting my speech now. The chronic issue with respect to ASEAN countries or those existing in Southeast Asia is they face the development issue which faces most emerging countries, which is they have a lack of investor confidence and an inability to rapidly industrialize, thus posing quite a few issues for their economy. There's a couple of parts to the model with respect to financialization. The first to note is that self-regulation often increases investor confidence. That is to say, there are strong incentives for people to increase investor confidence, to increase the level of funds there by showing a lot of transparency about the way that funds are being used and the ROI, or return on investment, that these assets tend to generate. The second thing to note here, or the illustration of this, is that BlackRock tends to be quite secretive, famously secretive about its investments, but is super transparent in emerging markets in order to drive up investor confidence and generate a higher level of funding and financialization of its funds in these areas. The second thing to note here is that in terms of these large banks, we think when they want to seek this expansion in multiple different cities, it means that they like less large banking institution want or have the incentive to act badly or not use the funds in a good way, because oftentimes they want to maintain a positive reputation for being good with using those assets. Insofar as they have future expansion plans into other cities, they want to avoid firms or local businesses being reticent about using their services. The last thing to note here on why banking institutions are likely to be quite good is that we think that banking competition is likely to be incredibly high. The reasons for this are a couple-fold. The first is that banks moving in are likely to be competitive, not only with international competitors that are going to increasingly move in the more that financialization is prioritized in these cities. But the second thing to note here is that we also have kind of internal competition within these banks, which is to say it's likely to be a very competitive hiring pool. You're likely to have a lot of candidates that are wanting to move in, whether or not they're expatriates coming from external institutions that want to move into the country, whether or not because they speak the language or just have the requisite skill set in order to perform well here. But also we think there's going to be more hiring within the city. There's a couple of reasons for this. First, we think that the local education systems are probably likely to be able to train more in financial services, which means you have more people being hired out of higher education in the local areas, more people being hired locally in Ho Chi Minh City. We think as a result of this, we have more skilled individuals, we have more skilled laborers, which means wages probably go up insofar as people are more competitive within this worker pool. It also means that we have more jobs, which means the locals probably do get some more money and have some higher level of employment. The other thing to note here is that we probably have a lot of spillover effect from international firms bringing in their best practices and regulations and guidelines and skill sets and having their skilled managers who are able to pass on this knowledge and their know-how and their reputation onto these other individuals that are being hired within the country, which means we probably also have effective laborers as well. The final thing to note here is that locals probably are able to integrate well or are probably going to be hired because these institutions want to integrate well within the country. And in order for them to do so, they need people that speak the language. They need people that have the local business connections in order to get the other banks around them to be able to get those loans as well. We think they also have internal training schemes to ensure that individuals are trained sufficiently to be able to do their jobs. So moving on to why banking competition is likely to be so high, there's a couple of reasons for this. Most of them deal with economies of scale. Because when you have more banks who all need to be competitive with one another in order to attract loans, in order to shell out these loans, in order to provide assets to local businesses, etc., we think there has to be innovation of the financial environment. This looks like a couple of things that all fall under economies of scale. The first thing to note here is that we have managerial economies of scale, which is to say we can get more individuals to specialize more in their respective roles, insofar as we have more effective and well-trained managers who are able to manage productivity within the firm better. We think necessarily this is less developed in a world where you don't have financialization or an increase in the financialization of these services. The second thing to note is that we have financial economies of scale. Financial economies of scale at the point where they're able to increase the size of these banking institutions. The reason for this and what this looks like is that firstly, firms do want to be competitive, and the result of this is that they offer a wider array of asset classes. They want to attract more investors and increase the ability of their own firms to loan out more, which means it's more likely that they're going to offer a wider array of financial services, whether that looks like securitizations, whether that looks like bonds, whether that looks like green bonds, whatever the case may be. The last thing that we get here is technical economies of scale, which is to say foreign firms are able to bring in new technologies that weren't previously available in these markets because they hadn't been developed, and then they can benefit from those as well. All of this is to say that the competition within this financial environment is likely to improve massively. The second thing that I want to talk about is what happens when you do just have more banks as a local consumer. I think what this looks like is more lines of credit, more people able to take out these loans that they are likely to pay back in the future, insofar as you have a wider amount of banking institutions that are able to make those loans and charge lower interest rates as a result, meaning you access a previously untapped market of individuals who previously could not access bank loans or even houses who literally had mortgages with interest rates too high. I think what this means is that oftentimes you are able to tap into a wider number of people who previously could not access financial services and were being previously locked out on that basis. We think we also have just more spending within the economy. Insofar as more people are able to take out those loans, they can generate more of a multiplier effect by spending more, and then employees end up getting more as a result of the wages going up because companies are making more profit because they're selling more product. As a result, you see this virtuous cycle of prosperity. I'll take your point at 6. The last thing that I want to talk about here is the bond market. And I think this is particularly special because oftentimes areas in ASEAN or Southeast Asian countries tend to have low financial stability, tend to have low investor confidence, tend to have low consumer confidence with respect to things like bonds because people don't trust the government not to default on its debts insofar as the IMF and World Bank and WTO are consistently bailing out emerging economies on the basis of the fact that they often default. The reason why this is so special is because you finally unlock people being willing to invest in the government, and this presumably has the longest term effects in the debate. The first thing to note here is that oftentimes you have an increase in the consumption of bonds for a couple of reasons. The first is that when you have this increasing financialization, people are more and more aware that their banks are unlikely to default, but they're also more aware that their cash is likely to be well spent. For all of the reasons that I gave you why this is likely to be done well, why the financial services are likely to be done well, people do have that increased confidence. I'll take a point from opening if they have one.
At the point of which large urban investment funds come in and buy up all the property in that area, it doesn't matter if they have jobs because people can no longer afford to live there, or they're paying extortionate rents, which means they cannot afford the cost of living.
Yeah. The issue with this is that firstly, these are huge urban areas, which means they have vast amounts of like buildings already. But even if that wasn't true, I think financial services means you can get more loans to build more buildings, which means even if it were true that they don't exist now, they're likely to increase in the future. I don't think there's going to be a disproportionate rise in the number of financial institutions without a commensurate rise to ensure that people are able to live there as well. I think also that if it is that expensive, people will just move out to suburban areas in the city. I don't see why this is necessarily problematic, but I also think that if there is going to be a rise in some wages, there is likely to be a rise in some other wages in order to compensate for that rise in wages generally. If there is a cost of living crisis, the government can deal with it more effectively because they have more funds to play around with because of all the mechs that I just dropped on why bonds are likely to be more investable. The second thing that we note here, which is also pretty important and also responds to that, is that you have more treasury inflation protected securities, which is to say people are more willing to invest in money that works for them, not against them, which means even if the point that Matthew just raised was true, we can better access protection against all of that because of the increasing amount of financial services. For all the reasons that people's lives just get better, we are so proud to propose.
Cool. I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for a fine speech. Invite Leader of Opposition to commence the case of Opposition bench whenever they're ready.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Financialization entrenches extractive urban development. It displaces the most vulnerable in Southeast Asian communities, and it also hollows out national economies in favor of short-term elite interests. Some rebuttal from what we heard from OG on why financialization just helps cities by giving out loans, etc. I think this is misleading for a few reasons. Oftentimes, loans are profit-driven, not development-driven, which means they're like not oftentimes going to be used just like given out to anybody. They also come with high interest rates and strict conditions, etc. Also, I think it's crucial to note that like credit oftentimes in societies goes to the elite, not the informal sector. Like oftentimes in Southeast Asia, you have small and informal businesses like street vendors or tuk-tuks, etc., that lack credit scores or collateral. So I think this pretty much mitigates their case. Going on to our first point on how financialization just fuels development that is like elite centric, and what this does is just prices out locals. I think framing here is that like Southeast Asian cities in general like oftentimes have large poor populations. They also have like informal economies, like I mentioned previously about like street vendors, etc. And also I think it's crucial to note here weak tenancy rights. I think this motion stands over the premise of like national governments supporting financial firms reshaping urban districts. I think the core contingency here is that when capital enters a city through financialization, it oftentimes doesn't serve everyone. Instead, it is optimized for return on investment and not necessarily inclusive development. I think The comparative here is that often traditional development like industrial zones or government housing oftentimes have public interest mandates, but this is not like within the scope of this motion. I think the MEX for this. So financialization prioritize high return real estate. So what happens is financial institutions enter city markets with capital to invest. They seek maximum return on investment. So what they do is they buy land in central districts, and they also build luxury like condos, high-end offices, etc. I think they avoid low-profit housing and small business infrastructure because it does not align with their capital values. I think the outcome of this is that it reorientates city development towards elite high-profit users. As this happened, land prices rise. Like because land is finite, competition from financial firms will just like drive prices up. I think what happens now is that landlords on the comparative, and I think this happens like universally within like even different like suburbs or whatever in the city still happens, and they now expect higher returns. What happens is they raise rents on tenants and local businesses. Informal settlements, which are like rampant in Southeast Asia, and just renters in general and small shop owners can't pay, which means that like just in general like evictions and displacement follow. I think that what happens here is we have a negative impact when working class people are pushed out of the central areas that they've historically lived in and worked in and formed communities in. I think then what happens is that a level of gentrification kicks in with both legal and social pressure. I think there are a few limbs to this. Firstly, in that financial actors lobby governments for zoning changes, and that they probably now want like more high-rise allowances or more mandates to evict for informal housing and more like promoting the use of like mixed use developments, etc. I think oftentimes authorities comply with this because they seek investor confidence, because that's where the capital is now like coming in and they're now contingent on that. I think poor residents lack the legal title to land, which means they face forced evictions and they don't have any legal standing or recourse on this. I think the result of this is that like formerly accessible spaces for these communities now become exclusive zones for rich expats and corporates. I also think it's important to note here is that public services and infrastructure likely follow the money in this area. So I think that once elites and firms move into an area, it probably means that like traffic or whatever improves, like roads improves, amenities like hospitals, Wi-Fi's, etc. Like schools flow into these gentrified zones. I think what this means that is like on the comparative, that outlining low income area zones then remain underdeveloped, and as poorer people are pushed out, they don't have access to the services either. I think the urban inequality deepens in two ways here, because poor residents both lose like their home and their housing and also access to crucial services. I think another impact here is that we have informal economies collapse, and that like oftentimes Southeast Asian cities rely heavily on street vendors or like night markets or other kind of like informal services in this way. I think financialized zones and the comparative push for like a clean, modern, sleek image, which means that like public spaces become privatized. Police probably crack down on informal sellers because it's seen as like in tension with this new like financialized city districts. I also think it probably looks like vendors on the street being banned as well. I think oftentimes what this means is that livelihoods vanish without replacement because these individuals don't have like the skill set to enter the jobs that are being like provided by this financialization. I think also as like displaced communities are like forced out, I think what this also has like a few like costs in that like commutes become longer, like transport costs rises. I think also like access to jobs and education and healthcare decreases, and that like transport community costs rise as well. I think these are non-monetary costs, but they also have like they just can compound like economic precarity in these like instances. I think it's important to note here on like why this is like unique to financialization is that like traditional development like industrial zones or government housing often have public interest mandates, whereas the comparative here is that financial capital is private, short-term, and also ROI driven. It does not care about long-term livability or affordability. I'll take a POI if there is one.
In every metropolitan area in the world, the financial district is deeply separate from where the informal economies thrive. I'm unclear why any of your mechanisms are mutually exclusive and why you can't have both existing at the same time.
I think the comparative here, or I think what you're suggesting is probably that like, oh well, it happens anyway. But I think like to the extent that these like economies don't have like major financial districts, I think when they come in, it just pushes individuals out. I think this is harmful in the short term for reasons that I've all given, and also in the long term because it's like as structures are built, they're harder to undo. I think this like has just a net bad. I think without financialization, cities can still grow throughout like manufacturing or tourism, and like SME driven development, etc. I think like governments retain control over social housing, etc. I think this is better. Okay, secondly, on how financialization can just like make your economy just more vulnerable to shocks. Okay, firstly here, as financial firms like flood in, they buy land, whatever, just creates more like high value urban core. I think what happens here is that it's important to know like wealth extraction and that profits flow out of the city to private shareholders. And they're not reinvested and they're not like stored in like government funds, etc. I think what happens here is that you've like local SMEs are priced out. They can't afford rent in financial zones. I think this is bad because in times of like global crisis, when global conditions change, especially like financial ones, capital exits rapidly. Oftentimes this is because like financial investors just value like safety and are risk averse. So cities can be left then with empty buildings, job losses, and debt burdens, etc. I think because the model in the first place is extractive, there's nothing back left to cushion the blow. Note that like Southeast Asian economies don't have the same like safety net that other economies have, and that they don't have like other industries, etc., to like fall back on. I think like we see this in like yeah, I think the counterfactual here is that you have like more investor in like local owned enterprises and infrastructure and green industry. For all these reasons, proud to oppose.
Cool. I'd like to thank the Leader of Opposition for a fine speech and invite the Deputy Prime Minister to summarize opening government whenever they're ready.
All right.
Thanks, Deputy Prime Minister, for a fine speech. Remind all speakers offering POIs is an important part of the game, practice into post decisions, etc., etc. With that being said, DLO to close top half whenever you're ready.
Brilliant. Just going to get my timer up quickly. Three, two, one. There are a number of crucial issues with what we hear out of opening government. I think, firstly, I just want to point out that they say at the point at which you get large financial retail investors coming in, they're going to buy up property, which means that local people get massive amounts of money. I just want to say that this is empirically untrue because most of the land in this area is not owned by local people who need the money to get it. I think this is owned by like generally people within those areas because there's a high like concentration of wealth and inequality. It is owned by very, very rich people, i.e. no Bangkok, where like the king owns the vast majority of the land within Bangkok and within Thailand. So you're buying off of people who are already rich. So the marginal impact on like the cash injection that these people get is incredibly low. But secondly, also because these people don't get the cash injection, because it costs enormous amounts of money to build sky-rise buildings. I know it's slightly cheaper in Southeast Asia, but it still costs enormous amounts of money to like bring in the people, to bring in the infrastructure, to build them to a level of quality with which people are actually able to live in these buildings and to do it all. That the point of which it is very inaccessible for these people to access this low quality housing, which means you lock in enormous amounts of the market because you only allow people who already have the tangible cash, who already have the cash on hand to be able to actually purchase these buildings. They then tell you that even if like, oh, you can just access loans at like a cheaper rate. But note particularly, in order to access loans at a cheaper rate, you need like some level of capital, some level of investment to be able to show that you have some level of security to the loans. No, they never tell you that people have security in order to pay for these loans. But also, I think at the point at which like these countries have like massive amounts of wealth inequality, where lots of people don't actually own much property, loads of people don't actually own the like products and goods and services that they provide for people, it is very difficult for them to actually access loans because they have nothing to provide in return, even at these very low interest rates. So it actually locks out enormous amounts of people from this market because you're only making the rich richer by buying land off of them. But secondly, you do not access the housing that is available to them. They also then tell you that there's going to be like loads of jobs for people within this economy in terms of like, oh, people who can like get in as financial analysts because people don't want to go in. Even if you take that their best, the issue with this is that the people within these economies who have the most amount of education, who have gone to universities, who have done all of these various different things, are those who actually have the access in terms of like they do not have the barriers to entry to universities to actually get into these places. They have like the return on investment to actually be able to afford not to have to work in like various different places. So the people who are actually more likely to be working in this financial services and access these jobs are the ones who don't actually need the money to the same extent as the working class people within these areas. I think they then tell you that even if their line of analysis isn't true, is that you just get like non-finance jobs at the point at which like you build up like investment, all of this thing. I think this is like entirely a wash in this debate because I'll go on to this in the future. But I think you have to make massive trade-offs at the point at which you support financialization. You bring in like what are generally Western finance companies like EY, KPMG, and like vulture funds which are going to buy up all of the housing. And no, I also just think like empirically untrue that like, oh, people get like more access to housing and like housing becomes better off and they can just move out of like local areas. One of the points which you move out, like, because what Santi says, the Prime Minister says, at the point which you move out of local areas, you like lose access to these places. Like it's very difficult to get back into it. Like noting like London, Dublin, Hong Kong, all countries that have like massive amounts of like high financialization within these places, whose land has been bought up by vulture funds, or the land is just incredibly inaccessible. It means people are forced to move out, like commute for like hours every day, but also don't have access to a lot of the benefits that you get out of like being able to own the land in that place. But also at the point point at which like these countries, a lot of these countries in Southeast Asia, their like biggest trading partner right now is China. Note like as in like Cambodia, like as in like Vietnam, and like all of these countries all like massively rely on China for like trade, and China isn't with them for like service economy, like it isn't with them for like the service and financial benefits of it. It's because of like the minerals and all of the like it's the minerals and also the sorry, what's the word? Minerals and industry infrastructure that you get in these countries, i.e. they can like trade with you to like get actual tangible benefits for China, at the point of which like you can then return investment into these countries. I think you lock out a lot of this investment because one, at the point of which you pivot, you're trying to push people into jobs that aren't actually to do with like the industry or like rare earth minerals and places in these countries. But also secondly, China is probably less likely to want to invest in these countries because you now have like massive amounts of like Westernism in these countries. You lose the ability for you to access levels of actual like influence within these countries. Why is this a bad thing? But one, because China is like actively investing massive amounts of money on their metric that people just like live better off lives. I think at the point at which you get like massive trade partners in return for like something that is like actually sustainable, like industry and like economies that aren't just based on services, which are based on like global financial movements, you actually can like get better jobs for a larger period of time. Secondly, also you are less dependent on like the global financial economy. At the point at which you have like massive financial services firms within these countries, at the point at which there is some form of crash or there's some form of financial downturn, one, these companies are more likely to leave these countries first because they are like not as invested in these countries, i.e. you can still make more money in countries like London, Dublin, America, like in New York. All of these places have like more access to funds that you can actually use to try and get away from the financial economy because they have more access to like wealth in these places. So you're more likely to leave the like Southeast Asian countries. But also at the point of which like there is this financial downturn, you then have very little things to rely on within your economy. So it's very difficult for you to actually get back in it because you lose massive amounts of things. Why do we win this debate? I think one, we win because of all the analysis that Emma gives you on why working class people, who are the most likely to be affected in this debate because they do not have the same access to capital, at the point of which they are pushed out, they lose their jobs, they lose their livelihood, and they also lose like their public spaces. This is a very like certain and like intense harm on these people, which would be weighed very highly compared to like a small tangible benefit for people who are already wealthy within this state. It's a very marginal benefit that they get to their house, and I think that the benefit that they get is not as important as the detriment to working class people because it affects them in a much deeper way, and it's very difficult for them to get out. I'll quickly take closing. Opening.
You still haven't responded to my earlier point on why financial districts and informal economies are often separate, but taking that aside, you also claim that the rich already own most property, which means it's unclear why the poor are losing out on their property anyway. Please resolve the tension in your case.
Okay, so what I'm going to say, well, firstly, at the point at which a lot of the central areas within these Southeast Asian countries, I think this is just empirically true. If you go to a lot of these places, in Cambodia and Vietnam, all of these countries, like their service based, like their economies are based on like these central districts. At the point at which you like push these people out, it becomes very difficult for them to like reestablish themselves, especially at the point at which like you have like massive investment in this case. Secondly, at the point at which like these people, like, yes, they own the land in these places, but at the point at which they like, as in for like the king of Thailand, is like a good thing for him to allow people to live on his land for like somewhat cheap amount because he needs to keep the people happy within his place. But also because like these places have like built up, you generally like have like levels of amount of thing. At the point at which you start to invest in like high-rise infrastructure, because of the added cost. Now, this is what they say is going to happen. The added cost of this just pushes enormous amounts of people out. Secondly, we win because of the trade-off you have to make between industrialization and financialization, because you just you have to invest heavily in one sector and try to push people into the financialization instead of another sector. This is very highly weighed because one, it is so like it is much easier to gain a massive benefit out of industrialization because it is a more like tangible thing. You can actually get things and you are not subject to the whims of the global financial crises. But also you have to lose off the Chinese investment, which is just a tangible good thing for people in terms of the amount of money going into this economy, and for all of these reasons, opening opposition.
Cool. I'd like to thank the Deputy of Opposition for a fine speech. Everyone's top has been a great debate so far. Time for the back half. Member of Government, whenever you're ready.
Hi. We swapped our speaking order, so I'm doing extension. Russell here, yeah. And then Ashna is doing whip. Before I start my speech, especially because this is a recorded round, I would just like to give a disclaimer that I'll be speaking about sort of economic experiences that, friends, family, parents have lived through, about, how Southeast Asia has developed. Some of these opinions are just not my own. They're just what we learn in school or what I understand to be historical fact. I might be wrong. This is, sort of important because I'll be going home to work, of course. Yeah, so that's just my disclaimer. The path to victory on closing government is very simple. Financialization is and always has been the key to economic restructuring and success in Southeast Asia. I want to be very clear about the reframe that we are going to do in closing government. Southeast Asian cities, especially the metropolitan cities that this motion specifically wants us to discuss, are already heavily financialized, and it is this financialization that has allowed them to achieve a high degree of growth in the past and going into the future. Our stance is simple. One, we support the positive historical effects of financialization because they have led to a more sustainable and inclusive kind of growth. And two, we support a continued financialization, and we say that we are prior to financialization in the 21st century, being done in an inclusive way, being done in an international/regional way through like mechanisms such as ASEAN, which is a larger sort of regional bloc between countries similar to that which we see in the EU, but in Southeast Asia. How are we going to do this reframe? The first thing to talk about is the history of financialization within Southeast Asia, which began in the 1990s. We think of financialization oftentimes starting in Singapore, but oftentimes we need to look at the history of the region as a whole. The region started, like in terms economically, in the 70s and 80s as an industrial region that then began to financialize in the 1980s through moving towards, firstly, export-oriented industrialization, but secondly, a deregulation of financial industries following countries like Singapore moving away from industrial projects and instead into financial deregulation. This is exactly what happened in Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand, and exactly what began to happen, but a bit more slowly in Vietnam in 1986 through the Doi Moi policies. This reframe is incredibly important, firstly, to establish the different pace at which these Southeast Asian countries developed. Singapore financialized first, followed by Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand, which deregulated a bit more unsustainably, and then Vietnam started to deregulate later in the 1990s after a very key event. This key event is the 1997 Asian financial crisis. And I'm going to be very clear about how it worked, and then talk to you about the implications of this crisis. The 1997 Asian financial crisis began as a housing bubble in Thailand due to poor regulation of the financial industry and of the housing industry that led to a high degree of speculation inside of the housing market and thus a huge housing bubble that led to all of the harms that opening opposition would like to talk about in terms of high housing prices. But then after this financial crisis happened, what happened is that we saw a decrease in these housing prices and an increase towards regulation, which I'll mechanize further later. The second thing that caused the Asian financial crisis was a high degree of speculation, specifically caused by the fixed exchange rates due to the currencies that were pegged by the US dollar within the Southeast Asian region, which caused massive political instability. And the crisis as a whole, when you put these two causes together, caused massive political instability that created the impetus for institutional change that addresses all of what opening opposition would like to talk about in terms of extractive industries. Okay, I now want to talk about the specific impacts that all of this history and reframing has had in terms of financialization and economic growth moving forward. The first is discrediting authoritarianism and leading to more sustainable, inclusive growth. Following the Asian financial crisis, we saw a large move towards liberalization in a lot of these Southeast Asian countries. In 1998, we saw the Trisakti riots, specifically in Indonesia, to topple dictators such as Suharto, who specifically allowed cronies to run the country, who removed the ability of the people to have a say in the economic growth and path of the country. In Thailand, we saw regime change as well, 6 financial ministers being gone through in 3 years. What this meant, therefore, is that a lot of these countries started to, firstly, implement free and fair elections, secondly, implement independent financial institutions. It is no coincidence that after the Asian financial crisis, it was the first time we started to see independent central banks within Southeast Asia and an increase in regulation within the financial sector and within specifically housing sectors as well that ensured that property bubbles would not happen in the future as well. Thirdly, we saw a move towards redistribution policies to make the gains of growth distributed much more evenly, as we saw in Malaysia specifically. Fourthly, we saw efforts to reduce property prices and to regulate them in the future. This takes down opening opposition because it shows, one, why structurally and historically we are able to get cheaper housing in these areas that ensures more inclusive growth. But secondly, we prove that it is financialization in the past, which was done in an unsustainable way and is going to be done in a more sustainable way in the future, that produces an impetus for institutional reform, which then creates inclusive institutions, not extractive ones, proving a long-term benefit of sustainable economic growth. The second impact to talk about is more economic cooperation in ASEAN specifically, because in the wake of the Asian financial crisis in 1999, the ASEAN surveillance process was established. This was the creation of the ASEAN Surveillance Coordinating Unit, which basically meant that there were standing currency swap agreements in the case in which a financial crisis or currency crisis occurred. And this reduced the risk or impact of crises and economic fluctuations. Because on all sides of the house, we acknowledge that a lot of these economic crises are just inevitable. The question then is how to deal with the economic crises in the face of increasing financialization and with the goal of trying to increase economic growth. And we say that a lot of these mechanisms meant that you had an increase in cooperation between countries, that there was more like cooperation and coordination between them and like communication to ensure that like the path of these countries could be determined collectively and to ensure that a lot of these crises would have a lower impact regionally. Is there a point of information? Opening? Closing? Okay. The third impact is that a lot of these countries were going to catch up much more sustainably. Because note my framing about how these countries developed asymmetrically in the past. Vietnam specifically, now that it has seen how the Asian financial crises and a lot of these issues have affected the like Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, now knows to learn from its mistakes. Because it was a socialist country that began to develop a lot more in the 1990s, and therefore it was able to liberalize in a much more sustainable way and financialize in a much more sustainable way heading into the 21st century, which is why it is now the fastest growing economy in Southeast Asia, because we get a lot more financialization, specifically starting in these metropolitan areas, and then the growth sort of sprinkles out to the rest of Vietnam. Which means then that we get a lot more long-term and sustainable growth. The weighing here is pretty simple. The first thing to say is that we are prior to opening government because we answer the question of why Malaysia and Vietnam are growing. We answer the question of why people know Singapore is safe, and because these countries have weathered the crises, because these countries now have a more stable currency that guarantees investors a higher amount of return and assurance that their investment will be protected in the long run in the future, which is how we are much more able to mechanize and get the benefit of cheaper bonds and cheaper borrowing that opening government would like to talk about. But the second is scale, because we get a higher degree of trade within ASEAN, which allows these countries to form a bloc to better negotiate with larger players like China, which is precisely why we have things like ASEAN +1, which allow for greater degrees of negotiation and greater autonomy within Southeast Asia. For all of these reasons, I've never been prouder to propose.
Cool. I'd like to thank the member of government for a fine speech. Remind all speakers again, offering POIs is an important part of the game, will factor in decisions and will be punitively affecting speech. With that being said, member of opposition, whenever you're ready.
Hi, am I visible? Audible?
And audible, yes.
Amazing. I'll start in a few seconds. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. Motion clearly states that motion supports financialization of key urban districts in these cities, not existence of financial sector in multi-million resident cities that we are talking about, which means that the burden of CO is to oppose financialization in key urban districts, not cities as a whole. And that is extremely important for our extension. Now, I want first to explain to you why financial sector will develop regardless, just not in these key urban districts that we strongly oppose. First of all, how can financial district develop in these areas? There is one model, like financialization, that this motion proposes of key urban areas, and examples, like notable examples that we know of are London, New York, and cities like that. But what we think is a way better way for these financial sectors to develop is building whole new financial financial districts. How this looks like? This has already been done in Moscow, in Paris, in many other places. So basically, in the city with the demand for these financial districts, they just find really underdeveloped municipality, usually on the outskirts of the city, like not in the center or in some really developed area. They basically dedicate it to be financial district, and then they develop everything in that area. They build all the infrastructure they need. They build all the buildings and stuff like that. As I said, that has already been done in many cases. I gave you two notable examples, and we think this has huge benefits. But before that, just quick engagement and why we say that financial sector has incentive to develop either way in these scenarios in these countries, and we are not opposed to it because it will happen regardless of what are the benefits of or losses of financialization of key urban areas. So 4 reasons why they will develop either way. First of all, we say these are rapidly growing markets with a huge demand for capital and loans, meaning they will most likely attract financial sector. Second of all, there is currently no strong competition in this area, in the financial sector. Third of all, we see these countries are rapidly growing, but also still have relatively cheap and relatively highly educated labor that can really be utilized in the instances of developing your financial sector. But fourth of all, these are export-driven economies, as all of the teams in this debate agree. But we say that as the hubs of international trade, these countries need to have the developed financial sector, whether we want it or not. But now I wanted to explain why it is way better that financialization of key urban area doesn't happen, but rather that we have a separate area, as I explained, as it has been done in Paris and Moscow and other cities like that. First of all, you are not occupying existing buildings. Like government is proposing you going in the city center, taking buildings that already exist and basically occupying, which as our opening clearly pointed out, leads to a lot of problems. But what they fail to do is engage with all the benefits that government is providing. So we say that in order for unlock the benefits of the government, we are more in support of the idea of building all this whole this new district. So how will that look like? So there will be a lot of jobs in the construction in all supporting areas, and we are not talking about like 10 people getting a jobs. Like these are multi-million resident cities. It will be like tens of thousands of jobs. Especially why this is important is because usually these jobs that will be unlocked in development of these areas are lower skilled jobs, meaning that they are helping the people that have like least amount of skills and least amount of chances in the labor market, which means which makes them most vulnerable, which means that we are going to help them and basically give money to them and hire them for quite some time. But also, we say that we agree completely that these all of these cities have real estate problems, but usually that is that is true in key urban areas. That is not like in the whole city the true. So now when you are developing whole this new district, all the supporting infrastructure and everything it needs, it will soften the burden of these key urban areas for population, because now these areas will also be okay in 5 or 10 years for people to live, which will relieve a lot of pressure in this population. But please notice that in these instances, a lot of secondary small and medium enterprises are contracted. So basically, there is a lot of, it's not just, putting a brick on brick. It's a lot of architecture, a lot of design, a lot of furniture making, plumbing, things like that. So you are giving a lot of these small and medium enterprises, first of all, know-how, and they are developing their skill set. But second of all, you're basically paying them money. You're giving them capital, which can help them improve their lives, improve the lives of their children, and so on. And we think that's an amazing thing. But also, please notice that all of these cities mentioned in the motion are extremely big. As I said, multi-million resident cities, but they usually have few municipalities, meaning that they are divided in few administrative areas. And usually this key urban district is usually the one that is richest and that already has the most amount of capital. But what happens is that if you build financial institutions here, you will just give them tax revenue and give them profit, but they are already the richest municipality and richest area in the city. Now, if you move it to the outskirts, you're giving it to the poorer and more unequal parts. For these reasons.
Cool. I'd like to thank the member of opposition for a fine speech. Once again, as I'm obligated to do so, I remind speakers to accept POIs. They are an important part of the game, factor into close decisions, and because of the new wonderful judge manual, affect speaker points. With that being said, Government Whip to summarize the proposition bench whenever you're ready.
Am I audible and visible?
Yes to both.
I'll take POIs verbally, please. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. First, I'm going to rebuild and defend our extension. Then I'm going to take out CO, then give some additional rebuttals against opposition bents, and finally differentiate from our opening, right? So to rebuild our extension was the following, and this clashes with the vast majority of the opposition case. Firstly, that the impetus for financialization had positive historical effects, and that secondly, that this is prior to sustainable and inclusive financialization that we see today. So to do some defense, right? Firstly, we have proven to you a structural mechanization for why financialization has occurred within the metropolitan cities of Southeast Asia. This is just empirically true, but Russell has also proved why this is structurally true. But secondly, our extension is necessary to prove why financialization is done well today, because firstly, it means that gains are redistributed evenly. It means that we have more accountability for political institutions, and it means that we have more international cooperation, which means that Southeast Asian countries are able to cooperate and consult with one another. That is to say, one country that has benefited from successful financialization is able to help another country do so. Now, to take out CO, right? CO states that their burden is to oppose financialization in key urban districts, not cities as a whole. And their frame here is that the financial sector will develop either way. Note that this does not clash with our frame, which means that they implicitly agree with us. But to weigh, firstly, none of this clashes with our extension, but secondly, we solve the problem that they identify by proving that the gains of growth will be distributed more evenly. The governments in the wake of the 1997 financial crisis have become more democratic, more accountable to the entire population, including more rural and impoverished impoverished areas. Now, note that a lot of their stuff about vendors seems to be derivative from OO, so we can deal with that together later. Now let's move on to OO, right? The issue here, and I'll provide like 3 main new rebuttals to opening opposition that OG didn't, right? So I think that firstly, OG didn't sufficiently respond to their concerns with the most vulnerable and working class people, right? They mentioned street vendors, for example, and the only response here was, oh, microfinance. But I think firstly, we need to recognize that street vendors, the street vending market has actually boomed since the financialization. So if you look at the Taiwanese night market, that has become a huge tourist attraction, for example, and it is like thriving in status quo. If you go to Bangkok and you go to street vendors where you get coconut ice cream, for example, all of these, like the street vending market receives another source of income, which is tourism, that has boomed from having greater financialization, right? There's more attention on Southeast Asia, but they're also just like with the influx of like foreign talent, for example, to work in these like financial firms, they're the ones who then go and travel locally, who go like to different cities within the country, right? But secondly, on industrialization, right? OO says that you lock out investment because you push people into non-mineral related industries rather than benefiting from investment with China. I think that firstly, a few rebuttals here. One, that these are different industries and they happen in different places, right? And these mineral factories aren't happening in urban areas. They're probably happening in much more rural areas. They're completely separate. And there's no reason why you have to necessarily de-invest from one to invest in the other. But secondly, in status quo, the investment partnerships, not status quo, sorry, without financialization, the investment partnerships these Southeast Asian countries have with China are rather exploitative, right? And that China takes their raw materials and does the most of downstream development of EVs in China, where they profit from the making of EVs. And note that the profit that you're able to get from like EV parts and a full electric vehicle is significantly greater than what Indonesia is making on pure raw materials, for example. But note that Indonesia, because of their greater financialization, was able to ban precious metal exports to China so that they could do more local downstream production, right? The mechanisms of this were a more liberalized government with more checks and balances, stronger institutions that we proved through our extension. The alternative on opposition is that this would have never happened. And so maybe they would have kept their partnership with China, but it would have been an exploitative one where they make little profit. What is the implication here? Firstly, industries have in fact thrived because of financialization. But secondly, Southeast governments are more capacious in profiting more from their industries due to their ability to do protectionist foreign policy with China, who keeps investing locally anyway. So essentially, you need our case in order to benefit from those stronger institutions and to like reap all of these financial benefits that OO tries to claim. But lastly, on how the government is able to protect local citizens, I think that while OG says that they have the incentive to do so, I think our extension proves the ability and the capacity to do so with greater liberalization and with those stronger institutions and just better political state. So how do we weigh this extension against OO? I think that largely OO is speculated. They say that production may be abandoned if a financial shock is strong enough, and the local population may not be supported. CG's extension makes concrete and guaranteed the benefits of financialization, and we win on certainty because we give you evidence for why objectively Southeast Asia is now less vulnerable to financial shocks because of financialization, because of the lessons that they've learned from the Asian 1997 financial crisis. But secondly, I think that we address their vulnerable actor better, and notably better than OG, right? Because people who benefit from greater industrialization, for example, are these people who are working in blue-collar jobs. The people who benefit from having a government that is less corrupt, a government that is better, that is more democratic, are the people who can now express be represented through their votes and to have policy implemented that actually represents them. Note that these people have political capital, even though they may not have economic capital. And on our side of the house, we better let their sort of political capital translate into actual beneficial policy for them. But now let's go with OG, right? I think that the issue with OG here
Last
is
chance.
that, yes, I'll take your POI.
ASEAN is incredibly linked to China in the first place. The point at which you start bringing in Western investors, it starts to de-incentivize China from investing with ASEAN because they feel like they can't receive the same amount of influence. And also, it is just better and provides enormous amounts of money for the working class within these areas.
Understood. Okay, firstly, I think that China already has strong incentives to keep investing in Southeast Asia. Geography is one. Just the other part that like it's generally very profitable for China to be in these relationships, and also the types of industries that China is benefiting from, like notably EVs, are ones that like work well with what Southeast Asia has to offer. And so there's not really that much incentive for China to de-invest just because the West may be investing more. Okay, so now let's claim OG tries to claim wonderful impacts that all depend on a capacious government, right? They say that efficient government increases international capital, but the route to efficient government was only more money through bonds. Our side of the house proves a better route, like our team proves a better and more certain route to an efficient government, right? Because they depend on our argument to us, citing that cites liberalization as historical evidence, right? Our analysis of the 1997 financial crisis and systems like ASEAN prove why financialization made Southeast Asia less vulnerable to shocks. And you should weigh this very, very heavily because it addresses the stakeholder that OO wants and it's prior to OG, because the poorest people are the ones who are most vulnerable to financial shocks, right? So as a result, our extension on liberalization is both prior to OG and accesses OO stakeholders better. Vote CG.
Cool. I'd like to thank the government whip for a fine speech and invite opposition whip to summarize opposition bench and the debate as a whole.
Hi, just to check if you can hear me.
And see you. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. I'll take a POI around the 5-minute mark. Put it in the chat. And just a minute. Okay, so let's first address what CG says about our case. So they have 2 points. Their first point is that they already addressed like these issues of redistribution and so on. But again, like a key thing that is missing, and this is our frame, and it's such a simple frame for everyone to understand, is this debate is about urban centers. If it was not, it would be, oh, this house supports just like all of these things, banks coming into Southeast Asia. There would be no mention of key urban areas and so on. So it's obvious that we are talking about like whether you should have a situation like in the city of London where you have all of the banks and so on, or whether it should be something different. What is different? We are the team that explained to you. Katarina is quite clear. She gives you, I think, 4 reasons why financialization happens either way. This is true both in the past that CG likes to talk about and in the present that the rest of the debate likes to talk about. Either way, you would have banks and like all of this stuff, investors coming in. But we say it is better that they come in and build a different district, like it was done with Paris, with Moscow, and so on, then move into city centers, such a simple case, and so on. Then their second thing is they say, oh, we are a derivative because we talk about vendors. But this is like a clear not understanding. All talks about, oh, you're gonna move vendors away from the city center, which is valid and so on. And we tell you, oh, you're gonna give jobs, a lot of jobs, a lot of investment and training to small and medium enterprises that are local and that are gonna help build these massive districts, like build all of these buildings, build the supporting infrastructure, build all of it, the cafes, the restaurant, everything. It's clearly, sure, we benefit like people working in the economy, but that's what economy debates are about. But it's different people and different mechanisms, not derivative at all, and so on. Okay, so let's now move on to the government teams. The reason we clearly go over the government teams is that at no point, not in opening government, not in closing government, do they prove why this exclusive, it has to happen in key urban areas like the motion says. They talk about the benefits of financialization, fine, why not? But we explain to you that you can get it either way because you will still have the same number of banks coming in, you will still have the same number of all of these investors coming in, only it's better if they simply take like a large number of like open plots at the outskirts of a city where no one lives and build there a massive district like it was done in Paris, like it was done in Moscow, then if they move into the city center and so on. So it's clear we get the benefits, the banks still work, we get the competition, we get the stability, all of that. It's just where it goes, who do we displace, who do we help and so on. So at the moment when the governments don't prove why this exclusive has to be done, and at the moment we prove to you why these like banks and all of this coming in will happen regardless, and why you can even get like massive benefits for building, I think we clearly go over there. Opening government, go.
Outskirt areas that face urban sprawl have the least transport connection, access to local labor, and worst property rights. A Chinese development bank isn't going to build in areas of high.
No. You're right, and that's good. They don't have a built-in infrastructure. They don't have transport, and that's why it's effective for companies to come in and build it themselves, because it's very, very, very difficult to change the center of Ho Chi Minh City. It's like crazy, and that's where you have more legal trouble because you have many owners, because you have historic buildings and all that. On the outskirts, you buy a large number of fields. fields, and you, together with the government, you build the infrastructure right there. That's why this was done many times. It's more efficient. Sure, you might marginally spend more money, but you can even adjust it to your own needs, and it's faster because you're building everything. You're not simply like buying, okay, we have this lot, maybe we need another one. Oh, he's not willing to sell. We have to see if we can expedite it and so on. This has happened and it's effective. Plus, you guys talk about the benefits of high rises. You know how difficult it is to build a high rise in the center of a city where you're going to block traffic and so on. But it's so easy to build massive high rises in open fields on the outskirts. It's easier for you to connect them. You can make sure that the open fields are not that far away from other crucial things that your people need, like an airport. It's such an effective thing to do. That's why it's done now. Old financial centers like New York and London, they have the old model, but now newer ones like Moscow that developed during the 90s, they use the newer model. This is simply true, and it's quite a good and effective thing. It's clear why it happens. Okay, since Katarina didn't have time for POIs, I'm going to give one to CG just so the judges are not mad. CG, go.
All right, so even if we give you equal financial development somehow without financialization, on our side of the house, we are more capable of protecting against bad institutions that lead to the things like housing bubbles, that lead to bad outcomes for the most vulnerable people. How do you respond to this?
But it's not true. Like you said, yeah, like banks, all of these things coming in, that actually is your mechanism for unlocking benefit. They will happen regardless. It doesn't really matter. They have the same impact if they're on the outskirts, building in fields and these massive districts, or if they're in the city center. They're still there. They provide the benefits. The benefits are not tied to if they're in the city center or 15 kilometers away from the city center. They're still there. The same people are there, all of that. Let's talk about our benefits and then weigh it with opening opposition. So I think we go over opening opposition for two clear reasons. First, we managed to take out the government teams by proving that that these things happen regardless. Like we explained. But second, like let's analyze our benefits. The benefits of opening government are for people living in the city center. They will pay higher rent. There will be like less taxes or whatever, and they might be. I think all of that is valid and true. But why are our benefits for the people building in construction, then later working in these like massive districts on the outskirts, and that providing tax to municipalities? Why are they better? Well, the first thing is vulnerability. Notice when you're moving away people from the city center, sure, it's not a good thing. Either way, we agree with opening opposition. But when you're giving jobs to people in the construction industry, those are people that are low skill. Those are people that usually don't have stable employment and don't have access to jobs and so on. The same is true for like small and medium enterprises. This is exclusively you're giving them because otherwise they're moving in. But this way you're building something new. There's a lot of massive unemployment. Well, with vendors, maybe they get replaced, maybe not. I don't know. I don't think they prove. But for taxes, and it's so important, these banks provide massive tax revenue. It's so much better if it's given to a municipality on the edge of the city that has less of a tax base, that needs more education, needs more healthcare, needs all of those things. Those are the things you benefit with these massive taxes. The city center is the best part of these places. Thank you.
Cool. I'd like to thank the opposition for a fine speech. Everyone has been a great debate.